Hi, I'm Selena from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester, and I'm here with Brooke Lea Foster, who is a historical beach fiction author. And Brooke, why don't you tell everyone what it is exactly, what a historical beach fiction book is?
Yeah, sure. So I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me. Um, Historical beach fiction is a beach read, but it's a mix between that and historical fiction. So I do a ton of research to kind of bring beach towns alive back in the bygone era. So my first book was set in Martha's Vineyard. My next two books, including the new one, All the Summers in Between, was set in the Hamptons in the 50s. The second one was set in the 50s. And then this one is set in the 60s and the 70s. So it's kind of a way to write an Ellen Hildebrand type, coming of age story and a story that gets into all the changes in women's lives and this friendship that I write about. But set it at a different time where, the issues facing women were very different and the way the beach, a beach town felt was very different. I can tell you the Hamptons felt very different in the 1960s than they do now. Now it's kind of like the land of excess, but it wasn't, it was a much simpler time then. And the same for Martha's Vineyard, which I researched very deeply for my first novel, Summer Darlings. So,
Hmm.
you're going to get a sparkly setting. You're going to get really interesting, intriguing characters. You're going to get a little mystery. But, you're also going to, there's a little more teeth in this book. So it's not just an empty beach read. There's a lot going on. But you're going to learn about a place in history and in time more so than you would in a contemporary novel.
Okay, and could you tell us a little bit more about your latest book?
Yes. So All the Summers in Between is, can I show it? It's such a beautiful cover. I feel like I have
Absolutely.
to show it off. So All the Summers in Between is about two friends who meet in 1967 at the age of 20 in East Hampton, which is out on Eastern Long Island. They get close really fast. They're sort of these broken-hearted young women who have come from very different places in their lives. One, Margot, is a wealthy city girl who comes out and vacations with her family on the weekends. Both of her parents are media stars in New York City. And Thea, my other main character, is a local, more hardscrabble girl. Her stepfather is a plumber in town. Her mom passed away a year ago, and she's been forced to kind of take on the role of taking care of her little sister. And so they both are kind of coming from this lonesome place where they just kind of connect really fast, and you don't really know where one begins and the other one ends. And as the course of the summer marches on, something terrible happens that there becomes this secret that they're keeping. And they grow estranged for 10 years after that summer. And the book begins in the latter timeline. I don't know if I said it was dual timeline, but it's dual timeline. And so the book begins in 1977 when Margot, the wealthy city girl, all grown up at the age of 30, quite literally sails back into Thea's life out in East Hampton. She has stayed out there and is still kind of a local out there. And they're forced to face the past. They're forced to face this terrible secret they've been keeping. They're forced to look at, back at their lives and look at how far they've come and yet how far they haven't come, as women. And they're also trying to figure out if they want to actually let the other back into their life. We've all had a friend that got away, someone in our lives who we cared about very deeply and maybe lost touch with. And there's moments where these people pop back up into our lives and we sort of are trying to decide, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And I think there's a lot of discussions, both internally in the characters and also between them, where they're trying to figure that out.
Hmm. So, what was the actual inspiration for all the summers in between?
So I love that you asked that question because as a former journalist, I was a journalist for 20 years. I love hearing how people get their story ideas as journalists, but also how fiction writers get their ideas. So this book was inspired actually by a vacation with my family in Maine. I wasn't even in the Hamptons, but I was in Maine. I grew up out in Eastern Long Island, close to the Hamptons, which is why I, know so much about that area. But I was on vacation with my family in Maine, and we were staying at one of those hotels on the water where they offer kind of a small boat ride to town to go have dinner. So it was a little Boston whaler, and we got in the boat, and my husband and my two kids and we were just kind of puttering across the harbor to town. And I looked up and I saw this very modest Victorian up on a grassy hill. And it was really pretty. There's gingerbread molding, just one of those really pretty Maine houses, old houses. And there was a young woman out on the lawn. She looked like a young mom, and she was hanging laundry on a line. And at her feet, there was a little girl doing cartwheels. And it was just this really postcard, picture perfect image. Maine has a way of turning back time. I think Massachusetts does too. You have so many beautiful old houses that have been preserved in time. And when I was looking at that scene, there was something about it. I just felt like a little bit of a stirring inside of me that, wouldn't have become much until I saw this glossy teak sailboat also come into my vision where I was looking. And it was like this juxtaposition of this woman up on the hill, very dressed very plainly, with her little girl hanging laundry, and this very glamorous sailboat coming, sailing past the house. And I immediately just had this vision of two friends, this local girl, and this more sophisticated city person and their friendship. And that's all I had. But that was kind of a lot, right? It was like an imprint, but I immediately just like knew I could just see the two friends. And we were on our way home from that vacation, and we were going over the, bridge in Maine where you kind of come into Portsmouth, New Hampshire next. And I remember turning to my husband and saying, I think I have my next book idea, and proceeded to, tell him and the kids what it was about. And then my kids are crazy. They immediately start hijacking my story, and they want aliens to come kidnap the friend. And, like they take it in a million different directions and get very excited. But when I got home from that trip, I started sketching out those characters, just these two friends. And the story kind of spun off from there. I really, really wanted to write about friendship, in part because friendship has been a theme in all of my novels, and yet none of my novels were about friendship, two friends at all. Friends were always played a critical role in the character development of my main characters, but I hadn't actually explored the subject. And I wanted to do that for a few reasons. One, I think I've always been very interested in how we need our friends so differently at different phases in our lives. So I remember when I was in my 20s and late teens, just how much more I would lean on friends, and I would look to them. I think we all do look to them to help us, flesh out who we are and bounce ideas off them and cement our identities, or we develop in opposition to these friends, right? And you're sort of using them to kind of prop up your self-esteem in those early years. And you just have to talk to them I remember like being that age and feeling like my day wouldn't be complete if I didn't talk to one of my best friends. I had two best friends. And then as I got older and I became a mom and I had a career and I got married and I was in love, I still needed my girlfriends very much so in my life, but I needed them much differently. I was much more secure in who I was. I didn't need to be, I didn't need a constant boost from a friend. And I just feel like the friends that I met later in life, we support each other in a completely different way. It's more, through book clubs and travel and lunches where we talk about our kids, and so that idea that these two friends could meet each other in such an intense way when they're younger, and then have this estrangement and then have them reunite, and them being in such a different place really interested me too. Part of that also came from the fact that when I was 19, I went on a cross-country road trip with my two best friends at the time. And we left New York on a 4-week trip, 3 or 4 weeks. I think it was 4 weeks. This was the summer after freshman year of college. And we were so excited because it was like, you lose touch in high school and you really in college and with your high school friends. And we wanted to kind of re-cement our bonds. And we packed up the car and we were driving down through Tennessee and we went through Arkansas. And then my one good friend had announced that asked us if we could drive to Roswell, New Mexico to go see her boyfriend, who turned out to be her husband. And they, very happily married and have kids. And so I don't criticize anything. But at the time, we were just so frustrated. And then we did it. And then as we left that visit with the boyfriend, she announced she wanted to go home, that she just missed the boyfriend and she just didn't want to be on the trip. And it was so devastating at the time, being 20, right? Because you're like so excited to be together. And it felt at the time that she had chosen him instead of us. And so instead of putting her on a plane, which is a long story why we didn't, but we drove home. And then we kind of lost touch. So that was kind of my story, that I never in a million years thought would ever influence a book 20 years later. But I do think that that pain of losing friends lives deep down inside of us. I think we just push it aside and we make new friends and we move on with our careers and our lives. And we, every once in a blue moon, may think of that person. And that really interested me, this idea that these people who we lose touch with and once played such a critical role, just what if you had some time to talk again? What would it be like? So yeah, that was
Wow.
a very long-winded answer, but I hope it
No,
that
that
was
was
all
that
the
was
information.
that was great. So, are most of your books deal with women's issues? Am I
Yes,
correct? Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
So, what do you think draws readers to these books, these types of books?
I mean, I think it's so interesting to get at some of the universal truths of women through the decades. It doesn't matter if what I've noticed is that it doesn't matter if a book is set in the 1960s or contemporary. A lot of the themes are the same. So one of the themes I think about with my books, someone was asking me recently, if you could name, they always say that authors go back to the same idea over and over again in their books. And the question is why, right? Why do we get obsessed with things as authors and we kind of keep going back to them? A lot of my books deal with class issues, the haves and the have-nots in a beach town. Um, but I also just think that my books are always about women finding the courage to ask the people they love for what they need. And I think that's really hard for women. I think that it can be really hard to put ourselves first. And I think going to whether it's a friend, a mom, a dad, a husband, and telling them that we have needs, that we need to put ourselves first can be challenging. And I don't think that that's something that's really going away. I think women have come so far, but it's still the struggle of taking on the bulk of housework and, the childcare. And our husbands are amazing and so much more egalitarian, is that the word I'm looking for, than husbands of the past. And still it's a burden. And so some of those universal truths really interest me. So in All the Summers in Between, it's 1977 when Thea, my main character, realizes that she may want to become an artist again. She, in 1967, when she's 20, she has these dreams of being a commercial artist and designing book covers or album covers. She works at a record store. And then she gets married and she puts kind of those dreams aside in pursuit of her husband's career and becoming a mom and being a good mom. And she loves being a mom and she loves being married. These aren't problems in her life. It's just that when Margot shows back up at her doorstep, it's a reminder of all of these dreams that she's let go of. And so then she has to go to, as she kind of realizes this more and more, she has to go to her husband and say, maybe I want to kind of do something else. Like maybe I want a little more. Maybe I need time. Like, is it ever going to be my turn? I think at some
Mhm.
point she says something like that. And it's really hard for her to do that. And I think that to me, that comes from a place of like it being hard for me. That was me going to my husband and saying, I think I want to stop taking paid journalism work and try writing a novel, right? How hard is that to ask for? Because you're asking for a dream. You're asking to, stop taking the practical route, which is having a career and making money, and kind of daydreaming on the page. So I think those conversations we're always kind of renegotiating in our relationships, in our marriages. So I like kind of exploring some of that. And then some of those other universal truths that are in this book that I think ring true through the ages is just how challenging it is to remain close to friends, even when both of you have the best intentions. There's no Friendship is so different than other relationships in our lives because there's no real blueprint for how to remain close and what it means to both friends, what that looks like, because it can look very different. Friends sometimes get up, grow apart and get angry with each other just because one's not willing to put in the same amount of time as the other one, even though that person loves the one just the same, right? There's just different expectations. And so I think the disappointments of friendship, but also the joys of friendship, a lot of that rings true in this book too. And also the friends who maybe aren't such a good influence on us, and we have to kind of come to that realization on our own, where we're really, we may have people in our lives who tell us these people are not necessarily good for us, but it takes us deciding and walking away or embracing that friend. So I just think all of those friendship issues are very complicated and interesting for everyone. So it doesn't matter if it's the 1940s, right? It doesn't matter if it's 2024. We sort of all are grappling with very similar issues. That being said, women were in a completely different place in the time period of this book. So even though there's universal truths in relationships, the way women deal with them is very different. So I often say, like, in terms of my books, I always see women, especially this book, women, in the 1940s were out working. Men were off to war. So women were out in greater numbers working in the, newspapers. They were in hospitals, and as, A League of Their Own is the famous movie, right? Where they are the baseball team. And when the 50s roll around and men come back, in the late 40s from war, then women are given all this pressure to go into the home and, rub their husband's feet, like the Cosmo article would say, and have the fire lit and massage his shoulders and all these things to keep your husband happy. And a lot of these women were, doing their hair and putting on their kitten heels and click-clacking through the grocery stores looking quite fabulous. But as we know from Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1962, these women were actually deeply unhappy, and many of them were very frustrated with this role. So I knew I didn't want my book, this third book, to be set in that time. That was what Anjin Lane, my second novel, was set in 1957, right smack dab in the heart of that time. But I wanted these two friends to be at a different point in history. So I wanted them to be a part of the late 60s. And what happens with women in the late 60s is they're sort of riding this tide, this wave, not a tide, a wave of optimism. So, women are marching. The National Organization of Women has been formed. The Equal Rights Amendment, they're considering a sex discrimination clause. It doesn't get passed until 1971, but they're talking about it in Congress. We have musicians singing about all this change that's taking place all around them. Grace Slick of Jefferson Airplane was famous for starting every concert with, "We're the people your parents warned you about," So this idea of us versus them, and young versus old, and women coming out on top, and women popping the political buttons. And my characters, Thea and Margot, in 1967, really believe in their heart of hearts that their lives are going to look very different from their mothers. And it's very exciting to them. And that is why I chose 1967, because I wanted them to be a part of that excitement. And when they reunite in 1977, what happens to women after all of that, that sea of change that seems to be percolating through our culture, the 70s kind of fall like a big fat hangover. And all of that, change is incremental. So the Equal Rights Amendment, yes, has the sex discrimination clause, but who's enforcing it, right? Women might be working in 1977 in much greater numbers, but they're making 62 cents on the dollar of their husbands, So what Thea and Margot, my two characters, realize very quickly when they reunite is that the people who they thought they were going to be, they're not the person at all. And their lives are actually very much like their mothers. And so, if I would have set this book in the 90s, there would have to be tweaks, right? Because we have to, as historical fiction writers, we have to use what's happening in history to inform the entire story and their choices and decisions and what they can do within the framework of where we are in society. So as a historical fiction writer, you also have to do a ton of research just about the way our cultural history has formed us. So
that's my next question is, how much research did you have to do?
a ton. So one of the biggest parts of the research for me, other than what I was just talking about, which is, reading all about, the women's history movement and whatnot, and music. Oh my gosh, I did so much music history research into the music back then, just because music was such a big soundtrack to a lot of people's lives then, and it created so much of that those protest feelings inside of everyone. We just had the Rolling Stones, we had the Beatles, we had so many people singing about change and psychedelic music and all these things. But what I really wanted to research is how different the Hamptons were back then, because that's the part that you can't necessarily read in a book. So in order to do that, I had to talk to a lot of local historians out there. I had to go to the libraries, look at images. I interviewed a lot of people who grew up summering out there in the quieter days. And also for this particular book, my parents met out on Eastern Long Island in Montauk. Montauk is the easternmost point of the Hamptons. And back then was just considered a quiet fishing village, but they had in that time, Andy Warhol lived out there, and he had a big estate up on the point. And he would have these wild, epic parties where all the, local and city people would come out. And my dad's band actually allegedly played at one of these parties. My parents met out there before they had me. And my mom would tell stories of the Rolling Stones at the Memory Motel, which is this really junky motel in the middle of Montauk's town. And Mick Jagger staying there with the band, and my mom and her friends like kind of staking them out. And so it was a really exciting time to be out in these quiet little beach towns, and very different from the 1950s, which is when Anjin Lane is set, my second novel, and that's set in Southampton. And during that time, it was, there was such a strict dress code out there. You couldn't show any, if you were wearing a bathing suit in town, you had to be completely covered to the knee. And one woman who grew up out there told this fun story about how her mom went to the market to pick up some steaks or something to grill. And she was wearing hot pants and a tank top, and she pulled up her car and hopped out right in front of the butcher to run in. And she was about to open the door, and a police officer tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Ma'am, you're gonna have to put some clothes on, or I'm gonna have to give you a summons." So it was that strict, It's like crazy, right? And for anyone who hasn't been to Southampton, East Hampton, Bridgehampton, all these beautiful towns out there, back in the 50s, right now, when you go through these towns, there's a ton of traffic snaking through on this one highway called Route 27. And you go through these little towns with pretty brick sidewalks. And now it's, Gucci and all the designer stores that line a lot of these towns. And then as you're kind of not through the towns and going from place to place, you're in the countryside, but there's privacy hedges and huge houses and lots of little streets. And it's a very developed area, even though it feels like the country. But back in the 1950s, you could drive down that same road and see all the way to the ocean across potato fields and spots. So,
Wow.
when Truman Capote was out there writing in the 1950s and 60s, he was living in potato fields with the ocean in the distance. And when Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock were painting, it was very similar. So it was a time of creatives and bohemians. And then by the time All the Summers in Between is happening in the 60s and 70s, the late 70s is just on the cusp of when the Hamptons go bad, where they get super overdeveloped, because a lot of that happens in the 80s. And it's not Ralph Lauren's fault, but it's around the same time that Ralph Lauren starts publicizing it out there. And, so it changes quite a bit, but it's really fun to go back in time in these beautiful places. And because you guys are in Worcester, I feel like I should say Martha's Vineyard in 1962, which is my first book, was also a much, much quieter place than it is
Yeah.
now. Right? Yeah. So
Definitely.
yes.
Definitely.
Yes, but yeah, for
So,
research, I do things like read, women's magazines of the time. I look at the clothes. I try to figure out what they would be talking about, both, in Summer Darlings, one of the big moments in the book is when Marilyn Monroe dies, because when she actually dies the summer that I'm writing about in 1962. And my mother always told me stories about how when she died, all the girls were crying, like all the teenage girls were crying, because it was just this horrible, horrible thing. And it stuck with me. And so I made sure that was in the book. So sometimes you can use real people to anchor a place too, in All the Summers in Between, there is a point where my character Thea goes up to Andy Warhol's house and interacts with him. And writing that scene took so much research, because, if you're writing a real person, you have to know what their cadence might be, what they might actually say, what he was doing at the time. Andy Warhol at that time was painting people's pets, believe it or not. So he had a lot of dogs up there at his house that he was always juggling, painting them. And so when she arrives, there's, he's literally working on a portrait of a dog, which is funny because that's not really how we picture him, but that is what he was doing
yeah.
around that time. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
Okay. So, what was the biggest challenge that you had in writing and putting out All the Summers in Between?
So it was my first dual timeline novel, and writing dual timeline I found so challenging. It was so fun and it's so rewarding, but it's really hard. And what I mean by that is that when you're telling a story in two different timelines, you just have so much less space. Even though you have the same amount of words ultimately that you're going to put out the book, you have to divide the book almost into two novels. You're pretty much writing two separate novels because the 1967 storyline is going to, it has to still have character development, the arc, right? It has to have Easter eggs in it that are, when people read the 1977 part, they're going to recognize and connect the dots, you know? So there's a lot of puzzle pieces that have to get snapped together when you're working that way. I found when I first started writing, I wrote the first three chapters. And when I say I wrote the first three chapters, I revised them and they were completely different by the end. But when I first started with the first three chapters, I was in the 1977 timeline. And then I would sort of naturally feel like, okay, it's time to go back in the past and figure out what happened. And I wrote three chapters in the past. And then I went back to the 1977. And at that point, I saw kind of where I was going to write to. I knew what the ending generally was. So I just stopped and I said, okay, in order to write the contemporary storyline of 1977, I have to know everything that happened in the past. So I just went to 1967. I wrote that entire chunk of the book. So in a completely separate Word document. And then once I was done with that 60,000, 70,000 words, I then wrote the present day timeline. And then I spliced it together in the way that it made the most sense to propel the story forward. But I found that really hard. It was just, it's a completely different skill set than my first two novels, which began at Memorial Day and ended at Labor Day. You know, it's a much more contained story. But it was also so much more rewarding because I think you learn so much more about the characters, and seeing them at these two different points in their lives gives a depth, you know, to the story and to who they are that you don't necessarily get otherwise. So yeah, my next book that comes out next summer is set on Martha's Vineyard, and that is dual timeline, but also dual POV. So it's two different points of view as well. And that was like, okay, I just keep having to challenge myself, but it's I love doing that because it was really, I hadn't done two different points of view before. So that was really, you just get into so much more when in this is about a family, when you can see the same family from two different perspectives. So I really enjoyed doing that.
That must be really tough to write, though.
So tough, so tough. So that book is about a family on Martha's Vineyard who the dad's a longtime senator and the mom is a Gloria Steinem-like figure. And the book begins, and they have three daughters. And the book begins when a year after the senator father passes away, the mother calls the three adult daughters back to the island because they have to sell the house, the beach house. And they don't have a ton of money. This was an inherited house. And and while they're there, they uncover all these secrets about the family. And so that's the 1978 storyline. But the 1965 storyline that's told from the mother's point of view is kind of the events leading up to the moment she becomes this Gloria Steinem-like figure, and what it is that gives her the opportunity and in this time period of 1965 to make that choice, why she becomes so bold in her ideas. And so yeah, and then the latter timeline is from the youngest daughter. So you can see how it's like very different families and very different time periods, but it all ends up weaving together and connecting, which I really love.
So, as far as weaving the stories together, how do you do that? I mean, uh, what's your secret? How do you do that?
I mean, like I said, I divide them into two separate documents and then I
Hmm.
start to, so I would say it all comes down to the rhythm, right? So first there's the idea of developing the plot and making sure your character arc is there. But once you sort of have that, what I tend to do is I read the document in a different size font and in a different font. It's an old journalism trick. So it makes the page and the words look completely different. So then when you read it, you feel like you're reading it for the first time in some ways. And when you do that, you can sort of, as you're reading, finish a chapter and just instinctively hear the rhythm of the fact that, okay, now it's time to go back in history and explain how we even got to this point. You know, history informs everything. It's the stories that make us who we are. And so it becomes very obvious at times, even though it seems like it wouldn't be, as to when the natural breaks occur. And there are even moments when I've written both storylines, both timelines, and put them back together and realized, wait a second, there's a little section of about 800 words missing here that needs to be answered. Because rhythmically and like as a reader taking in all the information, you can just kind of sense that something's missing. And so then I'll kind of stick things in later. But you know, from being a journalist for so many years, I'm the kind of writer that's not super precious with my words. I've learned how to be edited, how to take criticism, and how to cut a lot of words to make for a better story and a better moving plot. And so, you know, I'm able to write very inefficiently and be okay with the fact that some of it's going to make it through to the end and some of it will end up getting cut, but it will get me to where I need to go. So, so yeah, I think with a lot of writers, if anyone's listening right now, who aspires to write a novel, my biggest piece of advice is just to let yourself take criticism, because I think it can, some people aren't used to it and it can hurt. But the thing about it is that you'll never get better unless you kind of open up your mind and say, okay, this obviously needs work. You know, I need to keep working on this.
You know, there's an old adage saying, you know, show, don't tell.
Yes.
Um, and how do you do that with historical fiction and the way you're describing it? I mean, with the past, and how do you do that?
Well, show don't tell is something we do in journalism. So that's something that it's been drilled inside of me. I mean, rather than say you're on a beautiful island and the water is stunning, right? Which is an empty sentence. You're going to talk about what the water smells like, what color it looks when the sun changes its position in the sky. You're going to talk about a conversation people are having on the beach. You're going to look at what candy bar they're eating, because it's not going to be the same candy bar we have today. You're going to look at a newspaper headline on the cover of a newspaper and maybe just very quickly, you know, announce that someone's reading the Time magazine article, what happened to the, you know, who are the hippies or something, which is something I end up putting in All the Summers in Between. What music is playing on the transistor radio? You know, what is the gentleman who comes up to you, what do his shorts look like? Because I bet you they look different than the ones boys are wearing today. So you're just constantly seeing the entire scene before you that any contemporary writer would see, but you're seeing that scene in the past. So you're taking all of those details, what, you know, what cars they're driving and what the latest movie release is at the theater. You know, are they at a drive-in, or are they sitting on velvet seats instead of like the, you know, scratchy ones we sit on today? You know, is a curtain opening? So there's just, you can take it in so many different directions. And that's what I love about historical fiction, is painting all of those details, but back in time, you know? So when they're the two women in All the Summers in Between they go into the town of East Hampton, which, like I described before, is full of, you know, fancy designer stores now. Back then there was a New York telephone company in town. You know, there was with the bell in the window. There's the grocery store wasn't the fancy Cinderella it is today. It was a Bohax where women went and they bought, you know, dinner every single day to go put on the grill. You know, the art gallery, there were some art galleries back then for sure. But people bought albums at the pharmacy, you know, people went and got you know, an egg cream at the Candy Kitchen in Bridgehampton. So it's just, they were eating and drinking and summering similar and yet so very different. So I love kind of getting at those details. And actually, when they go to the beaches there, it's so funny because the beaches are very unspoiled and undeveloped in the Hamptons. And so other than the houses that are lining the beach, you know, the water is very much the same. And so there's two scenes in this book that take place on a sailboat in Gardiner's Bay, which is a small bay between the two forks of Long Island. And anybody who sails out there, you know, will recognize what it feels like to be out on those boats in those bodies of water. Similar up in Martha's Vineyard, you know, it has a timelessness when you go out in nature. And I think capturing some of that is really cool too.
Mhm. So, I mean, that just really proved that writing historical fiction is really hard because of all those little minute details that you have to research.
I tell you, there was one detail that drove me bonkers with the last book, because it was 1957, so it was just so much harder to get information. But it was, my character picked up the phone to dial a friend. And I don't remember why exactly I needed to put a phone number in, but I did. And I started to think, were phone numbers 7 digits back then? I actually don't know. So you have to think of everything. So I started looking into it. I couldn't find good information, but I found some hints that back in the 50s, people still didn't all have phones, believe it or not. People were
Right.
just starting to get phones in their homes. And have specific phone numbers. So they might have had a phone, but they called the operator who did all the connections. There was no dialing, right? So um, finally, after talking to a couple of historians, I found out they were 5-digit phone numbers. It took like 3 days of research when I like added it all up just to figure that out. So, but if I had said a 7-digit number, it could take someone out of the story completely, or you end up getting flagged for not doing your research, which as a historical fiction writer, that's what we prize ourselves on. So you have to be so careful. And if someone sprays perfume, if you're going to say she's wearing Chanel perfume, did that perfume exist in 1942 or whatever you're writing about? It has to Jean Naté. When did Jean Naté come out, right? If it's 1972 and it came out in 1973, you've messed up. So with all the summers in between, there were so many songs because like I said, I wanted to include so much music. And there were so many songs where I was even getting confused myself because they would be out in the late 70s, but then I would mention a song, like I might mention it in the 60s and get it confused in the timeline. So I had to go back before I sent it into my editor and check the release date of every single album and every single song. And even after I did that, I had a friend double check and she found one I missed because it's so much detail. You have to be so careful.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what else can we expect from you in the near future?
So I write a newsletter called Dear Fiction, DEAR, on Substack. It's dearfiction.substack.com. And I love doing that because it's kind of a way to combine my journalism past with my fiction writing. So I write about book recommendations, the behind the scenes of my own books. But otherwise, my next novel is called Our Last Vineyard Summer, and that was the one I was talking about the family, and that will be out next summer. I'll be kind of back out on the road for that one. But in the meantime, I'm in daydreaming mode again. It's the best part of the job, which is when you're just kind of looking around for ideas. You're open to what the next book may be. And I have some ideas that I'm considering. This would be book 5 for the summer of 2026 or 2027, however fast I can get it done. So yeah, so I don't have anything solid to report for that one, but I'm so excited to be on the beach this summer and thinking up my next idea.
Okay, you kind of answered my next question, which is what's your favorite part about being a writer?
So the daydreaming is amazing because it is the most fun part, but I love revision. I'm very much, people don't really, a lot of my author friends think I'm crazy when I say that. But to me, I write really rough drafts and I write really fast, knowing that I'm going to edit them and they're going to get better because that's my journalism past, right? That's how I've been trained. But revision to me is like chiseling, some kind of figure out of a piece of marble. You're fine tuning every piece of your story. And there's a lot of times where I'll write dialogue that's just somewhat placeholder dialogue. It's about what I want them to be talking about, but it hasn't really got into the real emotion of the scene. And I love going back in, putting on a really emotional song on repeat over and over again and kind of feeling the conversation and the rhythm of the words and making the story so much better, making the plot, figuring out how there can be a little bit of action and a little bit of heart on every single page, cutting out any of the pieces that are slowing it down. I love when my editor finally reads it and she can see things that I can't see. I find that so exciting because you get so lost in your own story sometimes that you don't know that in chapter 17, there's this 6-page section that no one needs to know. It's not, it's slowing down the plot. So I just love reworking and reworking and reworking until it feels right. And I tell you, there's this moment I've heard writers say, how do you know when it's done? How do you know? And it's done because you've written that final scene and you've worked on it so much that you just know the moment when the last piece of dialogue is set or the last line is just, it feels complete. And I've written many endings that the book is not done. It's just an ending. It's just a temporary ending and I'm going to get there. But when I go back and I really kind of dig in and I know that I've kind of can feel that satisfaction myself, that's when I know the book's done. And that's when I'll let myself type the words "the end" because it's like I know I'm here. Even if I know I'm going to go back and do a little more revision, I know I've made it to the end of the arc, and there's, some closure there for the reader and for me. So, but it's also so hard to say goodbye to your characters because you love them so much and they just become distant friends. You've sat with them for so many weeks and you're so excited to spend time with them, and then they're gone. So that's also hard.
Yep. Okay. What is the most challenging part of the writing process? And how do you overcome that?
I think sometimes the most challenging part can be getting to know the characters and what their limitations are and their limiting belief. You know, a lot of times in order for me to do that, I spend a lot of time figuring out who their parents were, how they raised them, and how that brought them to this moment that they're in today. So I find that challenging only because it slows me down so much, and I want to get the plot down on the page and get the story all formed so I know kind of who to go back and discover. But I find that it's a push and pull. Like I'm always tugging because it's you really have to stop and constantly get to know these characters and figure out what their choice would be at a certain moment and how they would respond if a person told them that, they were going to fail at something. Like, would they be angry or would they just thumb their nose at them? All of these decisions we have to make in a book, you have to really stop and get to know your characters each time over and over again on the page. So it's an amazing part of the process, but it is challenging because you do have to constantly stop and start, stop and start. Um, and that just, pushes back against my desire to write really fast, like I'm on a deadline and finish the story.
So, what has been your favorite adventure during your writing career?
Ooh, I would say I went down south on book tour when this book released. So I've never actually really been able to go on book tour because when my first book, Summer Darlings, came out, it was May 2020 when bookstores were shut down. It was
Mm,
horrible. It was such a hard time. So I like scrambled and did a Zoom party and whatnot, but the world was falling apart. So it was just a terrible time to put out a book. And then when my second book came out, it was May 2022. So some bookstores were doing events, but it was mostly the bigger names like an Ellen Hildebrand who they wanted to host because it felt very risky still. So I did do a few events, but not a real tour. So with this book, the world is finally 100% back to normal and I could do a real tour. So I went down south for a week and I made stops outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, Greenville, South Carolina, Myrtle Beach, Pawleys Island, Bethany Beach, and Rehoboth Beach. And I did a mix of, an author interviewing me or doing, speaking at a luncheon or doing a book signing. And it was so much fun, only because so many of my events had been up here in the New England area. And I love the idea of just being down with these Southern women who are so passionate about books and they just want to stop at your table where you're signing and talk to you about your writing. And, up here in New York, people are very fast moving and everyone's looking at their watch while they're asking you a question. So it was nice just to kind of slow down and do that. So that was probably my favorite one. But I go to the Vineyard every summer for 2 weeks and I love being there and I get so many ideas while I'm on that island. There's something about that island that is
yep.
magic for me, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I'm
Okay.
hoping that what
Oh, excuse me. Yeah, there is.
yeah, I'm
Oh,
hoping when I go there this summer that the same thing happens and my next book is just very clear once I'm biking and sitting on the beach and walking down to Aquina. I just love it.
yeah. So, which part of the island?
Do it. So we stay all over. So honestly, it's become harder and harder to rent a house there. So we go wherever we can find the right house. But we love Chilmark. We love going up island, honestly. But since my son became a teenager, we've been staying in Edgartown Village because he likes to walk with his cousins into town. It's kind of like when they were little, we stayed in Oak Bluffs because they could be on the carousel and it was very easy to like walk with a stroller. Then when they were kind of in the middle ground, we stayed a lot up in Chilmark because we wanted a house with a big yard so they could play outside and run around. And now that my son is creeping into the teenage years, now we're in Edgartown Village or Katama where the bike path is. So we're always kind of shuffling around. But But yeah,
Oh, wow.
it's the rental market's actually become really tough there for at post-COVID. So.
I can imagine. Yeah. Okay. So when you write your books, are you a pantser or an outliner?
Oh my gosh, I'm a complete pantser. I really think it's from my years as being a journalist. I just love to gather all the information, do all the reporting, get a sense of what my story is, and then just write. I discover a lot of my story and characters just through writing. When I was saying like I stop and start, it's really true because I love to figure out who they're going to be on the page and let the characters reveal themselves to you. You know, sometimes it just takes time sitting at your desk and working through a scene and seeing what they would do. Because I can sit there like a puppeteer and control everything, and I do to some extent, but a lot of times the characters end up revealing themselves to me and showing me who they are. So yeah, so I tried with Anjin Lane, my second book, to be more efficient, and I made an outline and I had an idea of what I wanted to write, and then I immediately threw it away and never looked at it again because what I find with creativity is that there's only so much you can rein it in. And so many of your ideas start unraveling as you're writing and getting excited and getting to know these people more and figuring out exactly what the story is going to be. So the outline just has never worked for me. And even in selling my books, I love to write the whole book before I sell it. So it was with this book, All the Summers in Between, I got a 2-book deal. And with my second book, I think my editor, I gave her like 2 sentences about what the second book was going to be about. I hated the idea of giving them some long description and then writing completely away from that idea. So I gave her, she was very lax about it and was okay with a couple of sentences. And then once I wrote the book, I felt so much better because I'm like, okay, I did it. But I hate the idea of selling a book on spec with like an outline because my books have gone in so many different directions than I anticipated when I first started writing them. So I don't like
Right.
that feeling. I just want to be able to
Right.
write it the way I want to write. So
Do your characters kind of take you in the directions?
they
Your
really
characters?
do.
Yeah.
They really do. Yeah. And I think sometimes even when you have people read your work, they show you things in things that might be missing in the book that then you end up writing in. So like with Summer Darlings, I remember the story is about a young nanny on Martha's Vineyard who goes to work for a Kennedy-like family. And when I wrote the whole book and I was having it workshopped, and I remember a bunch of my instructor and a bunch of my peers had said, I just feel like she's very serious. Like she's never a kid. She's never shows like that she's 20, like we never see her like that. And I thought to myself, she needs a friend. Like she actually, right. She doesn't have a friend on the island. So I wrote in an entire character called Ruth, who was a housekeeper in the house, and her mom had worked for this family for many years. And now she was working for the family, and she was kind of that local hardscrabble girl on the island. And they become really good friends and end up helping each other in all these unexpected ways. And it opened up an entire piece of the story that would have never been there before, right? So sometimes you have to also be open to surprises on the page and things that end up coming up. I know that with certain characters, I'll type, and I'm going to sound like such a weirdo when I say this, but I'll type a few sentences and see this new character arrive on the page, and I'll be like, oh, hi, because I get so excited. And I'm like, oh, you're here. Yes, this is what the story needed. And so there are surprises. And then there are even times where in All the Summers in Between, the book we've been talking about that just came out, the marriage between Thea and Felix, as I was rereading it, he was coming off so much harsher than I intended. I didn't see him as being unhappy in the relationship or being completely unsupportive as a husband. That wasn't how I saw him. But when I reread what I wrote, I was like, oh, he's coming off a little bit that way. And so I'm not sure why that happened, but that happened. And so I went back and I was able to kind of shape him and rein him in and give him more of a purpose in the story, which was something that, revealed itself as I was rereading. Because a lot of times when you reread, you kind of put a book in a drawer for 2 weeks and then reread it. You can see all these holes and all these things that need to get fixed. And that was one of those examples.
Okay. So you already mentioned one thing, but what piece of advice would you like to share with other writers?
So one of the things I always say is do a little bit every day. it's critical that you keep your mind in the story. So even if you can't write every day, if you have a full-time job and you feel like writing is really hard, go out at lunch for 20 minutes with a notebook and jot some ideas down. Daydreaming counts as writing. It really does, because if you're thinking about your characters and keeping them in your head, they're developing, they're talking, and so when you do have time, you can sit down and you won't feel like you're starting over. I think people can lose energy and when they get too distant from the story. But I also think, when I was a journalist for many years, I got accustomed to writing in the voices of the publications I was working for. So it was very easy for me to know that when I'm writing a story for the New York Times, I'm going to get a very, a little bit removed and scholarly voice. And then when I would write for, say, a women's magazine, you're writing much more colloquially. And so it was really a tough transition at first to go to novels where you were hearing your own voice. I was hearing my own voice for the very first time, and I had to trust that people would want to hear what I had to say, and I might have something interesting to offer as a novelist, and even just that I had a voice inside of me somewhere, because I didn't feel it right when I first started writing. And so my advice to people is, don't be afraid of your own voice. Go after, let yourself just write, and let yourself sound bad, and let those sentences not click together perfectly or roll off the tongue. Because the truth is, if you sit and you work at it and you keep pushing through your story, you're going to start to hear your voice, and and people do want to hear what you have to say. I would just say, believe in yourself more than you do. A lot of writers have imposter syndrome, and they feel like, I'm not a real writer. I'm just dabbling. Or no, you're a writer. If you're working at telling a story on the page, you're a writer. It doesn't matter if you haven't been published yet. And I can say that because that was me, right? I was a journalist, and yes, I was a journalist writer, but I didn't have a fiction novel under my belt. And I remember just feeling like, you're not real. You're not, but the truth is, looking back, I was. It didn't matter. I didn't have a contract yet. I was really writing a novel. So.
Okay. Are there any groups, clubs, or organizations that you might recommend to other writers that might have helped you in your career?
Yeah, so for me, when I want to do something, I immediately try to learn. So I got involved in writing classes, and that's what I recommend. I recommend finding, so I was at the Writing Center at Sarah Lawrence College, just because that's near my house in New York. And I think they do some virtual classes, but there's the Gotham Writers Center, they do virtual classes. I would just look for a writing group, look for people, an instructor who you trust, who you can start working with on your stories. It's important to describe your stories to a group and to let them read your words and get feedback, because, we all live as writers in a tunnel, and we're sort of in a bubble, and we're like, doing our own thing, but you won't improve really if you don't kind of get some instruction and feedback, and people who can kind of help you. So that's my biggest piece of advice. There wasn't a silver bullet in terms of a group, but I will say that being on Instagram, I really dislike social media. It is not my comfort zone. I don't enjoy it, but I will say that my my Instagram is all books and authors, and meeting other authors has been such an inspiration. It's been such a help when my books come out. We've supported each other so much, promoting each other's books. So I will say, start following some of the writers you admire. If they have a social media page, and check in with them every so often. You can ignore any people from high school you don't want to follow. You don't have to do that. You can create a feed that's just, centered on books and writing and the authors you admire. So I think that has helped me, actually.
That's good advice. That's excellent. Okay, now I have questions about you as a person. What is one thing that people don't realize about you?
I eat a ton of chocolate chips when I write. There's a lot of chocolate. I keep them near my desk, and I leave the little mini ones. Sometimes when I get frustrated, I throw them at the screen. Like, I'm not eating them. So there's a lot of that. What else? I'm a dog person. I have a golden doodle named Luna. And in all the summers in between, there's a dog in the story named Bee. And I really wanted to have an animal in the story that the friends um, knew when they first met, and then the dog is still there when they reunite, because it almost becomes this, familiar face in their lives, this connective tissue between them. And the dog remembers the woman, Margot, who had left 10 years ago. She remembers her when she sees her. And I thought it was just so sweet to imagine a dog, sort of still there and knowing them. And and just the way dogs witness our lives, and they kind of they're there from the beginning, and they're there through the hardship, and they're there through the joys and the sorrows. And it's just having the dog in the story was meant a lot to me. And that's just because I love my dog so much. My dog sleeps at my feet when I'm writing at my desk, and my breaks during the day without, when I don't have kids, at school pickup is me walking the dog. So I spend a lot of time with my furry friend.
Okay, you answered a couple of my questions. When you're writing, uh, what does your writing space look like? And what do you need to have around you when you're writing? Like,
It's a good question.
well, you mentioned chocolate and
A
you
lot of
mentioned your
chocolate.
dog.
I did. And you know what? I have a few books that I love. Let me see, because I'm in my writing space. One that I use a lot is called, I don't have it next to me, but it's called The Emotional Thesaurus. Have you heard of this? It's
No.
so helpful. It's like, so what it is it's a book where you can look up a emotion, like say perseverance or frustration. And then it lists all of these different ways that manifests physically in someone, and also what it can lead to next emotion wise. It's just when I'm writing, I love to glance at it every so often. It's not that I go to the frustration and they'll say he rubbed, someone might rub their chin, or I'm making this up, but, and then I make my character rub their chin. But sometimes just seeing a list of all different possible things that could be happening makes me think of what actually is happening. So I love keeping that near me. I do a lot of my writing in winter when it's cold. My daydreaming and idea sketching and some revision is done in summer, but for the most part, drafting is done a lot in the winter. So I always have tea. I drink a lot of chamomile tea up here in my office. And I have a lot of images of, I have a lot of vintage postcards of Martha's Vineyard or the beaches. Here's one from Martha's Vineyard, right? It's like, I keep stuff like this around where I can really kind of get a vision of what it was like back in time. Um, and I have photos of my family. Oh, and then I have behind me, can you see this painting right here with the woman and the towel? That's a T.S. Harris painting. I have 3 of her paintings in my house, and she paints all of these very moody mid-century women. And when my editor had said, do you have any ideas for a cover? I said, why don't you check out the artwork of T.S. Harris? Because she paints all these really, like, I feel like her paintings really capture my novels. And they immediately agreed, and they licensed 3 images. One of the images had just been snapped up. And we looked at the 2 that they offered as the cover, and we immediately just loved this cover because it seemed, you could tell the young woman was so, youthful, but there's shadows on her. And, you can tell there's something mysterious that's going to happen in the story, a little more intriguing than the average beach read. And we came to realize later, Beatrice Williams, who's one of my favorite authors, and now I count her as a friend, an author friend, we realized that her publisher got another T.S. Harris image, and her new book, which comes out Tuesday, Husbands and Lovers, has another T.S. Harris painting. So I love the T.S. Harris artwork. It's very, very inspiring. She calls it Sunshine Noir, which I think is so cool.
That is cool. So when you're writing, do you prefer silence or would you listen to music? And if music, what kind?
Yeah, so I do. Sometimes it's silence and sometimes it's music. I listen to music when I'm writing the real emotional scenes. So with all of my books, there's always one song I go back to over and over again just to kind of hit that crescendo as you're kind of going through the emotions. For All the Summers in Between, it was Yellow Brick Road by Elton John. It was of that time period when they reunite in 1977. And there's just something, there's so much longing and regret and nostalgia and a desire to be close, but feeling like someone's slipping away when I listen to that song. And so I kept repeating it, repeating it, repeating it when I was writing some of those big emotional scenes in that book. In Summer Darlings, it was When We Were Young by Adele. because there's a scene, a couple scenes in that book between the two, the matriarch of the Kennedy-like family and also a movie star, two doors down. And when they're kind of getting into some emotional situations together, I kind of heard their past, their younger selves kind of in their coding and the way they spoke. So I listened to that one a lot. So yeah, I listen to a lot of music in order to bring out the emotion. But when I'm drafting and I'm writing fast and kind of trying to just get the story down, I prefer to be in the quiet.
Hey, so I have two more questions for you.
Okay.
Okay. Where can people find your books aside from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester? And I always need to mention Annie's. You can you can get Brooke's books at Annie's if you call us at 508-796-5613, or you can email us at orders@anniesbooksworcester.com. And where else can people find your books?
So anywhere books are sold, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, bookshop.org, a lot of the independent bookstores in our area, in the New England, down the East Coast area, have my books. So yeah, you can kind of get them anywhere. They're just, they're everywhere. So,
Hey,
but you know what? I should send you some signed book plates so that you can have signed copies. And
that
that
would be
way,
wonderful.
listening. Yeah, I
That,
have some,
that,
so I can send you some.
okay, that would be great. All right. And excuse me, how can we follow your work and share your awesomeness?
Oh, thank you. So I'm at Brooke Lea Foster at Instagram on Instagram. I told you my dearfiction.substack.com is my newsletter, and I'm Brooke Lea Foster Writes on Facebook. So yes,
Great.
please follow me and let me know what you think of the book. And I love to hear from readers. So
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Brooke. It was a pleasure talking to you. And I'll be looking forward to getting the book plates. And anybody who
yes,
buys your books at Annie's, we will give you a signed book plate, signed book.
yay!
Thank,
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much for having me. This has been so fun.
thank you very much for coming, Brooke Lea Foster.